All right, well, welcome everyone to this month's edition of Estes Valley Watershed Coalition Presents. My name is Andy Ames, and I'm a board member of the Watershed Coalition. As many of you know, the EVWC was formed after the 2013 flood to help coordinate restoration efforts. To date, EVWC has completed 14 stream restoration projects along the Big Thompson, Fall River, and Fish Creek areas. Today, we continue wetland efforts. In addition, we're also working on forest fire or forest fuel reduction projects as well. Wildfires can have big impacts on our watershed, and that is where tonight's talk fits in. So this is how fires are fought. So Daniel Godwin will talk about the work the U.S. Forest Service is doing regarding wildfires. So
that sounds good. All right, thanks everybody. My name is Daniel Godwin. As you said, I'm one of the assistant chiefs up at the Fort Collins office and the supervisor's office for the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forests and Pawnee National Grassland. So I'm a wildland firefighter by training. I've been working in wildland fire for about 15 years. I also have a PhD in fire ecology. I liked it so much, I decided to add another couple of letters after my name. As I say, I'm a doctor, but not one of the useful kinds. And my position here is the Wildfire Crisis Strategy Program Manager. And that's a bit of a mouthful. And if you see references to ARP down there, that's for the Arapaho, Roosevelt National Forest and Pawnee National Grasslands, which is part of one of the units that we cover here. So I'm going to kick us off here, and we're going to talk about a wide variety of topics here. Sort of how we fight fire in a broad sense, some basic facts about fire, some of the things we're trying to do differently with fire. You know, we've been trying to put out most every fire for a long time, and it's not necessarily working. It's having some blowback on us, and our firefighters are great. You know, tactically, they're very successful, but if your big picture strategy is not the right one, you can be tactically successful on a fire, but the big picture of the strategy, you may not necessarily be succeeding. And so that's what we're trying to change how we're doing things here in a lot of different ways with a lot of different partners. So we'll start off here with, here we go. Sorry, my mouse got moved. There we go. There we go. All right. Let's talk some basic facts about wildfires. And for fire aficionados, this is a picture of East Troublesome. And I was on the ground here during the evacuation. Estes Park's a pretty important place to me. I have family up here. I proposed to my wife up here in the park, and we got married just outside of Estes and Allens Park. And so, this has been, I think everybody has some degree of lingering angst and trauma over 2020, and that's real. And that is something that we all have to process, on our own and together. And that's okay. Like, let's keep that out in the open and say that that is a normal part of the human experience. I experienced it myself. We had family members evacuated with us in our tiny apartment in Fort Collins, and their dog was so stressed out by the whole thing. It smelled so bad, just the stress sweats the whole time. I felt so bad for it. But that is a digression. We'll talk about some basic facts here. So let's think about the concept of a fire triangle. And so you may remember back to your scouting days, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, whatever. We have the basic fire triangle, which is made up of fuel, oxygen, and heat. And so you got to have all of those things for a combustion process to happen. Now you can scale up in terms of time and space here to this next fire behavior triangle. And that fire behavior triangle is the one we think about in wildland firefighting. And so it needs three things for a wildfire or any sort of, outside fire to occur. You got to have topography, how steep it is or flat it is. You got to have the fuel, the stuff that's burning, and you got to have weather driving it. We know that wind adds more oxygen to a fire. And so that's your oxidizer in there. And so it increases it. Relative humidity, which is the amount of moisture in the air, affects how dry the fuel is. And so those two things interact. And so when we talk about fuel, that's anything on the ground, on the surface, or trees or bushes or grass or leaf litter that is burning. And that's kind of a generalized catch-all term that we use as fuel. And then topography, fires burn faster uphill. And that's because the flame is actually leaning over and drying the material out ahead of it. And so it's producing that heat, it dries the thing ahead of it, and then moves up into that drier environment. And so it accelerates as it goes uphill. It's what we call a feedback loop, right? And then all of these things interact. Now, if you think about what we can do as firefighters to modify to try and put out a fire, all we can really affect is the fuel. Can't do anything about the weather, can't do anything about the topography. Those things are beyond our skills and our abilities and our budgets. But we can modify fuel, and that's what it all comes down to. Just like at this level, we can modify a lot of things. At this level, we can't. And so we'll also talk a little bit here about how there's another fire triangle beyond that, which is what we call a fire regime, which is about the patterns of fire over space and time, over larger periods of space and time. And so that's covered by climate, ignition. So what's lighting the fire? So is it people? Is it lightning? Is it lava in some places? It's coal seams in other places. I used to work doing military consulting, and for them, it's just training. They're shooting things like strikers, the type of small tank will, just the exhaust will light junipers on fire. So what's the pattern of ignitions? What's the climate in that area? And what's the broader patterns of vegetation? And so you can, all of these fire triangles interact at different scales, but they also have their own discrete elements. And so I think that's an important thing to just kind of frame some of our conversations here. So there's three types of wildfires, or three types of ways that a wildfire can burn. There's a ground fire, which burns underground. That's your coal seam fire. I'm from Florida originally. You may hear a yawl slip in here that's a little longer than the yawls around here. We get muck fires down there. The swamps burn for months sometimes, and that's underground vegetation that's burning, roots and decaying plant matter. Most of what you see is surface fire. That's the bush, that's the grass, that's the leaf litter, that's the pine needles. That's the stuff that we like in some ways, because as a firefighter, you can modify that. You can do something about a surface fire. The stuff that we don't have as much that we can do about once it's on fire is a crown fire. And so crown fires are when the fire gets up into the trees and either burns a clump or burns a single one, or in some cases, like we saw in East Troublesome and Cameron Peak on these big run days, you have fires that are moving independently in the crowns. They're going from tree to tree above the ground. And so you'll see sometimes on these big fires like that, the ground, the surface, sometimes is relatively untouched, but the trees above it have burned so intensely that it's just moving from tree to tree, whereas the ground is not as impacted. And so you need, for that to happen, you need some really high winds, and you need really dense trees, because the fire needs to move from the ground up to the next step. So one thing we need to kind of think about here is that wildfires start on the surface. Well, any outside fire starts on the surface in the brush and the litter and moves into the canopy. Doesn't start in the canopy, right? Even if a tree gets struck by lightning, maybe that thing moves on its own a little bit. It may torch out, but really, to get a crown fire, it has to start on the ground first. And a key thing to think about here is something we call ladder fuels. And a ladder fuel helps the fire climb up into the canopy. It's one of those things that's nicely intuitively named. We don't have a lot of those things in science. But it is those bushes, it is the low branches on a tree that reach all the way to the ground. Here, it's oftentimes junipers that serve as ladder fuels, because they like to grow up underneath trees. And so you have litter, the pine needles that then drape on that. The fire spreads into the juniper burns really hot. It then gets up into the branches of the tree, it torches out, and maybe it pushes into some other trees nearby. But that concept of ladder fuels, surface fuels, and canopy fuels is an important one. But I think, just kind of grounding all of this also is fire is natural in our forests. It is all of the trees, all of the vegetation communities here, they evolved with fire. They love it. What is not necessarily as natural is the intensity that we are seeing at times. Things like the lodgepole pine, they do want to burn at higher intensity than areas like the ponderosa pine. Most of what we see around here is ponderosa. Ponderosa, they evolved with maybe small patches of higher intensity, higher severity, but most of it likes to just go underneath that fire. And these fires that we've prehistorically seen throughout this area, they're lit by lightning and they're lit by people. Pretty much everywhere you find people lighting fires as a tool. They're doing it for wildlife, they're doing it for changing the vegetation structure to improve production of different seeds or nuts or things like that. And every subsequent wave of people living in an area go about fire sometimes a little bit differently. And that's just the somewhat natural human condition. I lived in Missouri for a long time, and one of the things that they were able to show there was that because of historical peopling in the Ozarks of what communities moved in there, whether they're Scotch-Irish or more English, they used fire differently. And you can still see that in the forest types there, because the Scotch-Irish are coming from more of a herding community. They were trying to light fires to improve the forage and the production for their sheep or cattle or goats or whatever the case may be. And so they brought that to Missouri and they brought that culture with them. And you can still see that on county by county levels based on where those populations came from. And so, yeah, I thought that was always a neat kind of way of framing the way we're thinking about fire is really more of as a human thing too. It's not just something that's happening divorced from us. It is something that is an innately human behavior. We have evidence of fire use by pre-humans that used fire to modify the landscape. I think Homo erectus is the earliest they found it for now, but that's about as far back as you can imagine. I mean, I'm an anthropologist by training before I got into fire, and so that's interesting to me. Click a slide. So how do we put out fires? There's two ways broadly that we go about this. We do something called direct attack, which is we put firefighters directly adjacent to the fire, and they've got a hand tool, and they're digging, and they may be, throwing fire or throwing dirt onto the fire adjacent to it, and they're putting in what looks like a hiking trail right next to the fire. Or they go off a little bit and they use a little bit of fire to burn out the edge of it. You can also do direct attack with, something like a bulldozer or a firefighting engine that can spray water. And so that, however, has its limited utility. And so I'm going to walk over here and wave my arms at this somewhat complicated diagram. So in fire, we call this a haul chart because it tells you what you need to haul to the fire. And it's, for us, it's kind of an ancient tool. It was first developed in the 50s as a way for us to understand what different options there are for us. And so along this x-axis is heat per unit area, so fire intensity. So that's British thermal units per square foot. So that's how much heat is coming out of the fire. So big fires produce a lot of BTUs per square foot. Smaller fires, less BTUs per square foot. And so on this one is rate of spread. How fast is the fire spreading? And so down here, basically it's telling us that anything under 6-ish feet flame length and not moving too fast, you can do direct attack with hand crews, with people. Past that, it gets real difficult. There's not a lot of options for direct attack at that point. And so that's where we moved to something called indirect attack, which is where we find where we can go next, where we can back off and find some sort of fire break that we can either create or improve. And we're going to light fires along that edge to pull in and stop that bigger fire that's occurring, right? And so really the only tool that we have when the fire gets big is that we have to go in direct attack, because this is going to be useless and it's going to put our firefighters at risk and for nothing to gain, right? And so basically if your flame lengths are over 8 feet, 6 to 8 feet, there's not much you can do about it. You got to back off and take a different tactic, or just pause and let it come out to a different fuel type that's burning, right? If it's burning in a brush field and it's putting up big flames, but then you have a grassy field next to it, you let it come to the grass and then you can do something about it, right? That's just, you got to think about what's burning and how you can address it in any given moment. And so I want to talk about indirect attack here. You know, why can't we do, why can't we put more firefighters out there to do direct attack? And let's see if this works.
Just listen to that.
Let's start a camera.
Was everything else? Look at the swirl on that.
Full on trees, all burning there. This is the first people that were on scene. And there's nothing you can do about it. They got a lake between them, which is good. But flame lengths like that, all you can do is indirect attack. All you can do is back off to the safest next spot. You know, rivers, ridges, and roads are the terms that we look for. And we're going to come back to this in just a second. But a lot of the fires in 2020 look like that when it did its big runs. And so that's why, you know, things like this should make you pause a little bit about what our options are out there. And that's why we're pretty bullish on a couple of different things, one of which is prescribed fire, because if you can use prescribed fire ahead of time, once it hits something that's coming out of the, you know, if it hits an area that's been burned in the last 10 years, it's going to drop down. And we saw that during Cameron Peak. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then, you know, trying to figure out when we have the conditions that we don't have to put out every fire, if we can manage it and we can say, all right, if it's in this box under these conditions, it's doing good work for us. How do we get to that stage? And we're not there yet. That's going to take working with our partners. That's going to take working with communities. That's going to take a lot more prescribed fire out there before we can get there. But we have to get there, because if we put out every fire, this is what we get. This is the end state. And if you thought 2020 was bad, the climate, it's not going to look better for that. Expect more of those and worse. So it's not official yet. Yeah. The question was, how did Cameron Peak start? It has not been entirely verified. The last I saw was a potentially abandoned campfire, but the investigation has continued. The problem is, how do you investigate a start of a fire when it looks like that? You know, it's just, there are not a lot of good options. So another reason that we can't fight every fire, and we don't put firefighters on the ground in every fire immediately, is because a lot of our forest looks like this. And if you can imagine, you got 20 young men and women out, hand tools that just look like the garden tools that you're using, hose and Pulaskis, which looks like an axe with another hoe end on the end of it, and chainsaws. And their job is to cut a path into this, right? They're clearing out a path to get to the fire just to find it. And they've got to have a good path out of there for safety reasons, right? Because they need to be able to move out of there quickly if things go sideways on them, or if they have an injury, right? That takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And then you see all these dead snags up there. When do we get a lot of fires? When there's wind. And what do trees do when there's wind? They fall on people, and that's bad. And so, in a lot of the areas of the forest, we get a fire report, and yeah, we start moving resources, but we don't necessarily put people on the ground immediately because a lot of it looks like this. And so we got to figure out, how can we safely get our firefighters in there? How can we safely get our firefighters out of there? And can they safely operate on the ground while they're in there? And so this looks a lot like what some of Devil's Thumb looked like last year. And that was a fire on the west side and kind of near, the Sulphur Ranger District for us, Kremling area. And it was hard. It was steep. It was just below the Alpine. It looked like this and like this, right? And figuring out ways to insert firefighters into there and find ways for them to safely operate. And we suppressed that fire. We put it out, but it was, we weren't putting the monkey to it. We weren't putting it out real hard because we couldn't safely do it. And, our first order of operation is firefighter and public safety, right? And we can't serve the public, we can't serve the natural resources if we can't get our firefighters in there safely and let them do their work safely. There's always inherent risk. I get that in firefighting. We all get that. But this is a risk that's really hard to mitigate. And we can do it, but it takes time. And in some areas that look all like this, and they've got a box around them that we can do things with, we consider what our other options are. Maybe we fire it off from a road, something like that. But right now, anytime it looks like that, we pause and we figure out what we can do safely. Because I don't want, I've never had a fatality associated with anything I was working on, but I've had injuries, and that's not a good feeling. Especially, we use the term in fire, risk a lot to save a lot, right? And the idea there is that you're willing to take greater risk if the outcome is, a more positive, a more valuable outcome, right? What's the risk, right? Or what's the outcome there? What's the value there? A bunch of dead trees. Is a 20-year-old on their first fire season worth that? I don't think so. It's not that we're going to not do something about it, but we're not going to go in there and just pretend that everybody's a bunch of Marines and hit it real hard. No, we're going to be smart about this. And so that's an important thing. I don't want dead firefighters. And people ask me about aircraft. Aircraft are great. They are pretty. They're the right tool sometimes. However, I was in the Marshall Fire, and people ask, why didn't we have aircraft up? And it's like, well, it was, like 100-mile-per-hour winds. You can't fly aircraft in that. And if you're dropping water or slurry, you can't, it's just going to be gone. It's just going to be like a rainstorm at that point. And we get a lot of wind-driven fires here. And so when you have high winds like that, all the aircraft are grounded. And so that's just part of the nature. And then this stuff, the pretty red stuff, we call it fire retardant or slurry. That doesn't put out a fire. That slows it down. It coats the vegetation with a chemical that makes it harder to burn, but not impossible to burn. You put enough heat on anything, you can burn it, right? And so this only works if we've got people with a strategy and tactics to back it up, right? It can give you some options, but you can't just rely on aircraft to put out fires or slow fires down for you. They buy you time. Helicopters, they'll drop water, and some of the other air tankers can drop water, and yeah, that can put out a fire. But, you got a bucket that at its biggest is, about the size of a car. How much water can you really move around with that? That's going to help you. And sometimes it's the right tool for a job, but it's not going to save us from the wildfire crisis that we're in, right? It's not a panacea. So one thing that's important to note is that wildfires are getting both bigger and more expensive. And, we continue to fight them, and we're having to shift some of our tactics on, because what we've been doing for the past 50 years isn't working as well in the fire environment that we've got. And that's just the facts of the case here. The other part of that is climate change will keep making wildfires more frequent and more intense. The recent National Climate Assessment, which is not exactly light Sunday morning reading, but it has a whole section on Western wildfires. And it is, I think my professional term for this is scary. And, you know, it should cause everybody pause and think about what this can look like. And so I see we've got like a 30 to 40 year window from some of the research I've seen to do a lot of good work on this landscape, and we've got a plan to do it. And we've got kind of pedal to the metal, but it's, you know, we also need the support of everybody to do it, to get there before it's a lot worse and a lot harder to do things like prescribed fires, which we know is our best tool. So, you know, the thing that I think I want to always bring home for people is there's no fire option. It's going to burn. And it's either going to burn on bad days or good days. And we can choose the good days. And it's going to burn on some of those bad days, whether we choose it or not. But if we can weight the amount of acres that are burning on a good day, that's how we're going to succeed, right? The days of thinking that fire was something that we could avoid on the landscape are gone. You know, that is 50 years of climate change, 100 years of climate change gone. What we have to balance is how do we scale up the amount of what we call good fire on the landscape, beneficial fire, while balancing that against the human health impacts, right? Smoke is bad for you, not gonna lie. I'm not gonna cut you anything but that. And prescribed fires do produce smoke, but they produce a whole lot less smoke than wildfires, and the composition of that smoke is very different. You know, it is vastly worse for you to be breathing in wildfire smoke than it is prescribed fire smoke. But that doesn't mean prescribed fire smoke's good for you. It's just not as bad for you, right? And so I think that's where, when we're lighting fires for prescribed fires, we do a very extensive smoke management planning process. We work with meteorologists to figure out, okay, how can we make sure our smoke goes high up into the atmosphere and disperses as far as we can. Wildfires don't do that due diligence for us. They just go wherever they want, and that smoke goes wherever you want. I mean, I figure it was about last year that I stopped finding ash from the 2020 pyrocumulus in Fort Collins in, you know, just my gear and my garden, you know. And I've never had that happen from a prescribed fire, and I've been around a lot of prescribed fires, so. You know, another thing that people say, well, why don't we just cut the trees, right? And, you know, it's a valid question. It's intuitive. The problem there is that, remember, our fires start on the surface. And when you cut trees, you're starting at the top. So you're taking a top-down approach to fuels management as opposed to a bottom-up approach, right? And so cutting trees has its benefits. We do it. We do it strategically and we do it tactically. But I think you should be under no misconception that we can, you know, thin our way out of this problem, because it doesn't. Even if we thinned all of the forest out there, and there's a lot of areas with too many trees from a fire standpoint, you would still have those surface fuels. And if you don't introduce fire into that system to manage those surface fuels, you'll never really change the fire behavior. You know, you may reduce the chance of a canopy fire or crown fire, but you still have really intense surface fires. And that has impacts on our watersheds, that has impacts on wildlife, that has impacts on just recreation and how we use the forest, right? So it's a tool, just like aircraft is, and just like anything else. You know, part of the problem here also is that, I might have gotten ahead of my trees. Yep. Nope, we're good. We also don't have a lot of you don't really have a logging industry here, and that's because our trees are small. And most of the time, we actually have to pay people to cut the trees as opposed to at the forest, as opposed to selling the trees and then we get money, right? In other areas where trees are big, they're worth something, we can sell the trees and get money, and that's kind of a twofer, right? Like we can do a little bit of fuels management and we can get some money for the forest to do more fuels management. Here, we actually just have to pay people to do this work, which is not a great business model to be in as a federal employee. But it is necessary sometimes, and we do it. The other problem is we just don't have a lot of loggers, honestly, or sawmills. We actually have more archaeological site sawmills on the forest than we have sawmills in the area that are active now. So we used to have a timber industry, and then we cut all those big trees in like the 40s and below that and before that, and now we don't have much of one. Question?
So would trees that size not be profitable for loggers?
It really depends on the market. Some places, because the profitability has to deal with, you know, transportation costs as it gets to the mill, and then from the mill to secondary processing. And so the economics of logging is complicated, and I do not pretend to be a timber specialist, but I can tell you the broad trends. And this is not a picture from here. This is just a generalized one from the Forest Service Flickr feed. If you need some high quality images of forestry operations, that's a good place to find them that are public domain. So just a generalized view here. Thanks, good question. So I talked about this. Fire removes the surface fuels necessary. Thinning removes the canopy, but it's helpful, but not required. Let's talk another fact here. We're in kind of a middle elevation site here in Estes Park. You know, if you're doing prescribed fire in the grasslands and the shrublands, they grow back really fast, which is problematic because you spend all that planning and money to burn that, and then the next year it comes back. And so there's a lot of good reasons to burn grasslands and shrublands. You know, a lot of those species benefit from it. You can do things like patch burn grazing, where, you know, you rotate what part you're burning and what part you're grazing with cattle. A lot of good reasons to burn that. But from trying to change the landscape wildfire risk, it's not going to do all that much for you. Not here, at least. You go up here in the higher elevation in the lodgepole, you can't really use what we call broadcast burning, which is when you're burning a larger area. You can do some pile burning. You can do some work along road edges. But once you know, this is what it looks like when you burn lodgepole, right? It's a crown fire. That's what the lodgepole wants, because when you burn lodgepole, it's trying to burn hot and intense so that its next generation of seedlings can come up. You know, the cones themselves actually need heat to open up. So there are places that do prescribed fire in lodgepole, broadcast burning, but it's like, you know, British Columbia, where there's not a lot of people living. Good reasons to do it. Not something we're going to be doing here. But over here, that's a view of what it looks like in Ponderosa. Ponderosa you can burn, and you get about 10-ish years of good fuels treatment there, where if a fire hits that again, once you've burned it, it can drop down. In some areas, you know, in the next 3 to 5 years, sometimes it just won't even burn. There's not enough fuels on the ground. You know, if anybody's tried to garden here, it's not easy. We don't have really productive soils here. It's even worse up here, you know? I'm in kind of the clayey western Fort Collins foothills. It's not great. It's worse up here. It's rocky, right? And so while annoying for gardening, that's great from a forestry standpoint because things grow slowly. And that's why our trees are kind of piddly and not worth a lot of money, because they grow slowly. But it also means when you put a prescribed fire in there, you have efficacy for a longer time. And that's great. We like to see that because you get a bigger return on your investment for a longer period of time. From Florida, we have to basically burn everything every 2 years. Or after that, you might as well have not burned it in the first place. So that makes it harder to do. So we call that kind of a Goldilocks zone, right? Ponderosa pine, mostly surface fire, mixed conifer. This Doug fir, mixed conifer transition is kind of in between, you know. Doug firs don't really like that much heat on them. They struggle, they have thin bark. Whereas ponderosa pine, they got that big shaggy bark. They love fire, right? And that's an adaptation to fire. The thicker a pine's bark is, the more adapted to surface fires they are. The lodgepole pine, real thin bark, right? And so it's not trying to survive the fire, it's trying to burn its neighbors. And there's a whole like field in fire ecology about flammability studies. And so there's a bunch of different plants and tree species across the world that do what's called the burn thy neighbor. And the way they survive their evolutionary niche is to burn the plants around them and then come in and reseed afterwards. And so if you've ever been to like Cape Town area of South Africa, they've got the fynbos there. It's like it kind of looks like California chaparral, but really colorful, a lot of flowers. That's what it does. It's like one of the most you know, well-studied examples of this burn thy neighbor kind of thing, because all those plants, they've got all these oils and terpenes and things in them. They burn really hot and then they come back. Some of them actually need smoke to flower, which I think is really neat. You can tell I'm kind of a botany nerd too, which is okay. We're a pro nerd environment. It is how the eucalyptus works in Australia. And then when they brought it to California, good question. If you didn't hear it, is that like the eucalyptus in California? Eucalyptus in Australia does burn hot to try and, you know, as an adaptation to fire, to burn other things around it. It's not native to California, which is what's contributed to some of the big fires that have occurred out there. You know, the East Bay complex in the late 80s was a big one that was driven by eucalyptus. Good question. Yeah.
Protection against fire.
Yes. Yeah, so good question. Redwoods are another what we call fire adapted species. They love fire. They have nice thick bark and they form fire scars really nicely, which is means that they can get damaged by fire but still grow, right? And so that's another way that fires or that trees can be adapted to fire. And then the seedlings come up more in areas that have burned, right? They do have an upper end of that. And so, you know, some of the fires that occurred in Sequoia Kings Canyon recently that were really high intensity killed a lot of those redwoods. But if you look at some of the areas, I have some friends in the North Bay that do some burning in redwoods on private lands, actually. And they're seeing great results. They're doing low intensity surface fires. And, you know, the redwoods love it. They see a bunch of sprouts coming from that. So, you know, coming back to this, you know, to borrow a phrasing from the Supreme Court, I feel like we have to move with all deliberate speed, right? We have limited time and resources to do a lot of things before the next big fires. We know they're coming. We are going to have more Cameron Peaks. We're going to have more East Troublesomes. And that's just science, statistics, you know, choose one. It's not great. But I would rather face the challenge together that presents to us than to pretend it won't happen. So what? You know, one thing we can think about from a strategy standpoint is we know that fires generally move from west to east on the Front Range. You know, it's different on the other side of the hill, but here we get these downslope winds. Fires move that direction almost always. Every once in a while we get weird little things that occur, but our big fires, especially our big runs, they're occurring from west to east. You know, Cameron Peak on one of its big run days traveled 17 miles in a single burn period, right? And so when we are thinking about prescribed fire, when we are thinking about fuels treatment, we have to be thinking on that scale, right? So that comes to our next point. Big fires roll over small treatments. That's Cameron Peak. So suppose that little meadow is your prescribed fire. Well, that's nothing. You know, it's going to roll straight over that. If it can move 17 miles in a day, 10 miles in a day, 5 miles in a day, if we don't think and act at scale and work together to scale up the work that we're doing, it's meaningless, right? You know, we jokingly call those things random acts of restoration, right? If it's just little blobs out there in the landscape, it doesn't do you any good. You know, as a kid, I really liked at a science museum, the water tables, if you've ever seen those things. Water's flowing and you can like put blocks in it, right? And so fire can move like water in some ways across the landscape. And so if you just have these random little blobs, it'll flow right around it. But if you have bigger things like a sandbar almost, you know, you piled up a bunch of stuff there, the fire has to flow around that or it's going to peter out there. And so it takes the steam out of it. You know, another metaphor that I like, and this is probably most relevant to me because I'm from Florida originally, is thinking about these things like barrier islands. Can it not hear me? I want the 5 people online to be able to hear me. Got an orange light on it? Okay.
Just go ahead and try to clear the box. That is not what I want to do.
That's all right. I can try and drive that. Thank you for technical difficulty pause for the audience. Yeah, no rest for the weary. Okay. All right. Well, we'll go with that. Thank you, internet people, for letting us know. Yeah, so think about it like a barrier island or mangroves, right? When a hurricane comes ashore, that depth of barrier, you know, the sand, the mangroves, the wetlands, that takes a lot of the power out of the storm surge. And so we can think about prescribed fires and altering the landscape as a similar way to that. It's like mangroves in some ways. It takes the steam out of the system. Question?
Question jumping back to
yeah.
Fires going from west to east.
Yes.
I've only lived here for 2 years, so I really have still a lot to learn. But
of course,
it's kind of counterintuitive to me to think of the eastern slopes of the Rockies.
Yeah.
He said the fires also like to go uphill.
That's a great point. So the question was, you know, if fires move from west to east, how does that basically account for the topography of the Rockies, which is going from east to west? And the issue here is that most of our big fires are occurring under these wind events that we get. These, you know, there's different terms for it, but basically it's high altitude winds surfacing and going real hard. And I have a large section of my fence that blew over in that last event. And I'm sure everybody has had experiences with that. Yeah, most of our fires are wind driven as opposed to terrain driven. When the winds die down, they tend to become terrain driven again and kind of finger around. But the big stuff is all wind driven. But great question. That's, yeah, thanks for bringing that out. So, hold on, wrong tab. Here we go. No, come on. Okay, so really it comes down to how do we scale up prescribed fire? Prescribed fire is, you know, it's a safe way to apply a natural process to reduce wildfire risk and increase ecosystem health. You know, that's like the bumper sticker version of it. I do have a bumper sticker on my car that just says "Good fires prevent bad fires," which I think is a nice pithy one. And I've had people like squint and throw up the kind of like, what the heck is that about? Which feels like it's a good opportunity for me to proselytize. You know, have you heard the good word about good fire? But usually it's when I'm like pulling out of a parking spot that I see them do that. So how do we do this? We're going to do this with pods. And I'm going to talk about pods here in a minute here, which are potential operational delineations, right? And pods merge data science and expert knowledge. We do a bunch of fancy math. You know, they got a machine learning algorithm upstream of it that combines topography, fuels, and previous fire footprints, which then feed into this and basically find where on the landscape we are most likely able to stop a fire or do something about a fire. And so what it tends to do is find ridges, rivers, and roads for us. And then it helps us determine, are those rivers, ridges, and roads, you know, kind of help us to grade it. Is it good or bad? Is it easier or worse? Then we combine this with expert knowledge, a bunch of firefighters in a room, and we start drawing out these maps. And so what pods end up being is kind of our fundamental unit of analysis for thinking about fire. Just like a watershed is kind of the unit of conversation for hydrology, this is the unit of conversation for fire, right? And so what it ends up looking like is something like this, kind of an idealized version, right? So you got like a previously burned area down there, you've got some ridges, you got some roads, you got some rivers, and you start drawing these little blobs on the landscape and containers in some ways. So containers for fire, containers for risk. And so we can look at how Cameron Peak interacted across the landscape here. And so the slide is actually out of order, but you can see it slowly growing. This is where it started. You saw that video, grow, grow, grow. Over here is one of our large-scale prescribed fires that we completed up on the north end, and then that's the High Park fire footprint. So gonna keep growing. Boom, big run day. Another big run day. Squirts around a little bit. And then it's gonna kind of move around. But you can see it hit that prescribed fire, stopped it. It hit High Park, stopped it, right? And so this is, when you hear me say, or anybody else, fire is the treatment, this is what we mean. Because the only thing to stop things like this, especially on those big run days, is fire that's been there before. Can't thin our way out of it. There's a lot of thinned areas in here or old timber projects in there, burned right over them. Little blobs on the landscape, kind of random acts of restoration. Yeah, another big one. And so we had a pod edge here that we were getting ready to burn it out and we missed the window. And so we wanted to keep it here. And we just didn't have the time. And it pushed us before we were ready. And so we can look at these pods, right? Green lines here are pods. This is Cameron Peak growing. And so you can see a lot of times we're stopping it on pod edges. It's kind of an example of what, how these natural edges that we've identified and improved out there are working. And just kind of another counterexample here. You can see that pod edge there that pops up. You can see where it hit the High Park fire. So this is what we're trying to do here. This is our strategy in one big kind of food pyramid here, or Maslow's hierarchy of prescribed fire. This is a lot of what we're doing. We're working with our partners. We're working with Estes Valley. We're working with other community and Watershed and timber and all these different groups. That's collaborative planning. And what we're trying to do is strengthen these pod boundaries, right? And so oftentimes that means, you know, where we can, we're thinning off of a road, or we're doing a shaded fuel break, which is another type of thinning, or we're burning as much as we can. And where we can, we want to scale that up to burn within these pods. We want to do a lot more prescribed fire. And depending on where we are, we're also doing some of this boutique work here. But we know if we're only focusing right next to communities, by the time the fire gets there, it doesn't matter, right? That's why we got to think big upstream, right? Like if the flood is already at your house, that is not the time to be putting up barriers around it, or thinking, oh, well, I put up some raised, you know, HESCO sandbags around my house ahead of time. That's what a WUI treatment is. It's important. We're going to want those. But what you really want to do is do the upstream work. And that's what we're thinking about here, to try and do that. And eventually, when all this is in a better place, we want to be able to take a wildfire ignition and say, you know, the community supports us for this. The weather is in a good spot. The fuel moistures are in a good spot. We've got fire behavior modeling telling us it's good. And we're going to say, okay, let's burn it out. Let's bring it out to a pod boundary. Because we know that every wildfire we put out today, even under a 95th percentile condition, in a few years, that's going to be the 90th percentile or the 80th percentile. Because what we think of as hot and dry now is nothing, right? And so we're just transferring the risk into the future for every fire we put out. And sometimes we got to do it, but we got to figure out a way that we can get to a point where we can take different steps and not just put every fire out with impunity or, you know, as fast as we can, right? Because we're just pushing that off into the future. We're letting our kids and our grandkids deal with that under hotter, drier, denser conditions. And I don't think that's a moral choice that we should make, right? I don't think that's good. And that drives me. But we know that, you know, no one pod can stop a big fire run. You know, if it runs 17 miles, it can blow over a treatment. We know that. But the network, right? The network of interconnected treatments, that's what we're trying for, right? We want different large scale prescribed fires on the landscape. We want pod edges that have been treated. We want to focus on evacuation routes, all of this in concert. That gives us tactical opportunities, because if a fire is moving at 100 miles an hour with the wind, or the winds are 100 miles per hour and the fire is blowing and going, we're not going to put people on the ground in front of it. We're going to wait and we're going to pick it up on the next couple of ridges, but we've already done the work to identify that and we've treated them. That's what we're shooting for here. And so this is what we're looking at. You know, we call this the ribbon, a sequence of linked pod treatments going north and south, because we know that if there's holes in our treatment, the fire is going to find it, just like water will, and squirt its way through. And we want depth to it too, because we want to be thinking about what a 17-mile run looks like. We need to be thinking at those kind of scales. And that's not saying that every fire that starts in here, we're just going to let run around and do its own thing. We're always going to put people to fight a fire. We're always going to put people to manage a fire, but we need to be changing the way we think about it and what opportunities we can set ourselves up for, right, with things like this. I don't really love the term the ribbon, because no one really feels safe around a concept of a ribbon. It doesn't really convey strength, but the nomenclature is a little bit of cat out of the bag. Yeah, it kind of looks like it, huh? No, it's just an idealized drawing. It's just we had a graphic artist make this for us to help us explain this concept, because it's kind of abstract. So how do we do it? We worked with our partners to figure out, okay, where are you all working? Where are you on the ground? What landscapes are you working in? And so we found Watershed groups are actually a really good group that brings in a lot of partners together. And so there's a Big Thompson kind of larger group that brought in Estes Valley and some of the other watershed groups together, and you know, conservation districts and fire departments. And we all said, okay, let's figure out what are the pods that we want to prioritize our effort on, right? Where is our best bet to get our return on investment? Which parts on the landscape should we focus on? And so we did that. You know, we went through this process from north to south, from the Wyoming border to I-70 with different collaborative groups there, and identified where we should put our focus. And it's bringing in, you know, both expert knowledge and values, right? We could put this into a computer model and spit it out, but that doesn't matter, right? Because this is about people, and this is about different communities and what they value. And so that's why it was important to me that we go through this process and work with people on the ground and work with different collaborative groups. Moving faster. All right, got 6 more slides. So this is how we stitched a ribbon from different pods. We broke this collective action problem a little bit, and we collaboratively identified these pod boundaries, right? I kind of hit on this. This is value-based. It's not just a mathematical model. It's about what people find important. And so this is what we end up looking at, right? This is a map of, you know, this black line is one of these priority areas that the the government's giving us a lot of money to focus on. And so where are we? Around in here. You've got the Black Diamond NEPA, which is one of our planning areas for future fuels treatments. We've got this new one that's coming online, which is called White Pine, which will be treating a lot more work in that area. We're still analyzing this. This is St. Vrain, which if you have any partners that live, down the hill towards Boulder and Gold Hill, that's a big project they've been working on together. And so this kind of pale area here that runs north and south there, that's the ribbon, right? Those are the pods that all these different groups came together and said, we want to focus our effort on scaling up fuels treatment and prescribed fire in these areas. And are we going to burn every acre of that? No. But we can all say, all right, table stakes, this is where we want to focus our effort. And we can focus on our part of it on the forest side, and different conservation districts and fire departments can focus their efforts on other parts, and we can all start coming together around it, right? And I just said that, I got excited. And so, what we're trying to do here is come back to that older statement here of no fire is not an option anymore. We got to figure out how we can live with fire and how we can put fire to work for us, right? And my goal is to take a lot of the risk out of the landscape from a wildfire standpoint so that people can also start managing the risk better on their own, right? I have a lot of friends that build and burn piles on their private land. I have some friends that also do broadcast burning on their land. And no one's really comfortable with the broadcast burning part on private lands here right now, but I think we can get there. And the way we can get there is changing the landscape wildfire risk. And that's something we can do on the forest side, but we can only do that together, right? This is the great challenge of living here in the mountains. It's beautiful. I love it here. But with that means we have a responsibility to work together to address these problems, right? So to recap, fire is the most effective tool to reduce the risk of bad fires, right? Pods combine best available science and expert knowledge, and a pods-based strategy helps us scale up the amount of good fire on the landscape. That's what we want to be doing. And that is it. Thank you. I think you're just closest to me, and you all put your hands up at once, so I'll go with you. Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
So the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition has just gotten huge grant from the state, I believe.
Mhm.
Are you familiar with
Is this the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, CWDG, or the COSWAP, the CWG? Yeah, okay. That's federal money.
Federal.
Yep.
Okay. But we're also getting state grants, I think that, yeah. So the idea is to link as many properties together so it becomes a pod.
Yeah.
I believe.
Effectively, yeah. Right. So to repeat that, Estes Valley got a bunch of money from both the federal government and the state to do a lot of good fuels treatment out there and trying to link it as much as possible. And which is great. The Forest Service isn't doing a lot of work here. We're doing some pile burning right now, but it is in the future. We will be bringing broadcast burning here. And the more that we can work together, the more that we can align things, the better, because that's, multiple times during Cameron Peak, that's what I saw was it dropped down when it hit something that had been burned before. It's what happened when East Troublesome pushed in, it hit a previously burned area in Rocky. It was split by Fern Lake. Fire is the treatment, and it takes all of us. It's the term we like to use, all hands, all lands, right? It's all of us together.
So the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition is part of the Watershed, and that links all of the players together.
Yep.
Because prior to that, there were independent fire
Yes.
districts, right?
Yeah. And so, just to recap that, there's a group called the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. The NOCO Fireshed is the short version of it because it's a mouthful. And that it's a group of groups, and it's all about trying to get us to a point where across all lands, we're able to receive fire. We can live with fire. And so that takes everything. That's everything from public health to actual on the ground fuels treatment to working together on, standard processes. It's a whole lot of different moving parts, but it's a really great organization. And Estes Valley is a great participant in it. And we really value their input. Yeah, thanks. Different hands right there.
Just two quick things.
Yeah.
First was, with the fires that were prescribed, or obviously the fires that we had, doesn't the amount of smoke and stuff in the air actually exacerbating problems with, getting the climate problem that's causing issues there?
Particularly, so the question is the impacts of smoke and emissions from prescribed fire and wildfires on climate change, and it's real. Wildfires are a huge contributor for CO2 in this country, and we know that prescribed fires emit less than wildfires, even on the same patch of ground. And so if we can burn it under controlled conditions, then we can get the benefit out of it while minimizing the climate impacts of it. Because if we know we don't do that, the wildfires will contribute to a feedback loop, right? It gets us hotter and drier because of the emissions, which makes more wildfires burn, which makes more wildfires burn.
The second part was like trees obviously are massively for clearing the air.
Yes.
Developing that pattern. Is that going to be an issue with even prescribed fires where you're limiting the number of trees, which is going to cause more issues with problems of the trees being able to clear?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was about, if we're removing trees, will it impact the ability of trees to provide kind of benefits of clearing the air and cleaning the air? Probably some marginal effect of it, but again, it's weighed against the knowledge that if we don't do it, it's going to be so much worse, right? It's like we either thin them and end up with less trees, but still some trees, or we don't, and we end up in a brush field, shrubs that keep burning, right? And so one phrase I like is that prescribed fires keep forests. And if we don't do that, they end up in, some folks call them zombie forests, where they never grow back up into forests again. They just stay in this frequent fire, like invasive grass and shrubland loop. And that's much worse in the long run. Yep. Good question, though. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Of course. My pleasure.
I have two questions. One, if the East Troublesome fire had reached Estes Park, would the whole town have burned or this part of it?
I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. If East Troublesome would have gotten to the town, would all of Estes Park burn or just parts of it? That's counterfactuals are always hard. A lot of what slowed down East Troublesome was the fact that we got a snow event that night. And that gave us time. And that wasn't a given. And I try and not dwell on what it would have been like if that hadn't happened. Like I said, because this is a very special place to me.
And my second question can you do a controlled fire in a wilderness area?
You can, yeah. So the question is, can you do prescribed fire in a wilderness area? Yes, there's hoops you got to jump through, but you can do it. Both on National Park Service lands and U.S. Forest Service lands. Yep. Good question. Yes.
Okay, first of all, you're doing a great job on Lily Lake.
Thanks. Yeah, a lot of good work on that.
The thing that worries me is Old Fall River Road, where it's 10-foot deep. Are you going to clean that, or are you going to burn it?
Yeah. So the question was about Fall River Road, and so as just a quick caveat, Fall River Road is managed by the National Park Service, and I work for the U.S. Forest Service, different federal agencies. We do work together. And I don't know of any current plans to do fuels treatment on Fall River Road, but I do know their staff over there, and I can pass along your concerns to them. It makes sense to me, but again, it's all about trying to get our best return on investment. And so I think they're focusing a lot on that like Bear Lake corridor because they're worried about another kind of East Troublesome blowing through there. Yeah. Good question though. Anybody else? All right, happy to help. Yeah. Of course, my pleasure. Yeah.